know that there are toxic chemicals. There's about 16,000 chemicals in plastic, about 4,200 of them we know are hazardous. So we know that they're hazardous. We know that people who work in plastics factories get cancer. That's not very contentious. But the question now is, when you have microplastics in your body, what does that cause? What kind of disease does that cause? And we're at the early stages, but I can tell you, it sure doesn't look good. I have not come across studies that are like, hey, this is looking great.
Welcome to The Big Interview on Monocle Radio. This week's guest is Ziya Tong, the award-winning science reporter and broadcaster best known for anchoring Daily Planet on Discovery Channel Canada, and more recently as the author of The Reality Bubble, Blind Spots, Hidden Truths, and the Dangerous Illusions That Shape Our World. With a decades-long career communicating weird, wonderful, and worrying scientific discoveries, Ziya's latest investigation leans heavily on that worrying end of the spectrum. Made in collaboration with award-winning director Ben Adelman, Plastic People, The Hidden Crisis of Microplastics sees Ziya investigating this invisible threat alongside leading scientists and asks what might be done about it. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I spoke to Ziya Tong on The Big Interview. Ziya Tong, welcome to The Big Interview.
It's great to be back.
Well, let's start with the film Plastic People, and let's start specifically with the title Plastic People, because as I understood it, your contention is that basically we are all now plastic people, at least in part.
Yeah, basically, we're calling this Barbie the horror movie. So yeah, we have a lot of plastic in us, and scientists are starting to discover it in all different parts of the human body. So we really wanted to make a connection in this film, the connection between planetary health and human health, and to start to show people that when you trash the planet, you will very literally trash the human body.
Because, just to be clear, you are talking entirely literally that we are all now absolutely riddled with plastic. I mean, that sounds put like that bad.
Yes, that is an understatement, but it was something that, I had to experience firsthand, to be honest. I think we all read about the statistics, we see the headlines in the newspapers, but I actually put my own body to the test in this film. So I went around the world, met with leading microplastics researchers. I tested my own blood. I tested my own feces, which was incredibly unglamorous, especially on the big screen. And we met with scientists who are studying it in various organs, including some groundbreaking research as well. Well,
we should talk about that term, or at least narrow that term down. When we talk about microplastics, what specifically are we talking about there?
We're talking about plastics that are less than 5 millimeters in size. So there are different forms of microplastics. There are microplastics that are created that way. The plastic industry creates nurdles from which larger plastics are melted and formed into larger products, but they start off quite small. Then there are plastics that are small that go into things like cosmetics, tiny beads, and the like. So those are also microplastics that often get flushed down the drains and into the toilets. And then there's a third form of microplastics. These are the plastics that are ground down from larger plastics, whether it's toys, whether it's plastic bags or what have you. And with the sun, with heat, with erosion, with all these different factors, sometimes in the water, with waves, with friction, these plastics break down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. They just get ground down into dust-sized particles. And these are the particles that we eat, that we breathe, and that we drink. In fact, we are breathing microplastics without a doubt right now.
Well, that's an encouraging thought. With no spoilers then, when you looked into your own body and looked into your own data, what did you discover roughly about how much plastic you are presently made up of?
Okay, so what we don't show in the film, because as you said, not too many spoilers, but I will give away one. I did test my blood. Of course, when you're giving a sample, you're giving a very small sample, right? And so what you're seeing on the screen in the film and in the documentary is what comes out of my body. I think what's more surprising, or shocking to me anyway, was what was actually circulating in my body. So on average, in each sample, they took about 2.5 milliliters of blood. You know that that's just a few drops. Anybody who's cooking, that's like less than a teaspoon. It's very small. So in that amount, they found on average between 2 to 11, on average around 11 microplastic particles in 2.5 milliliters. I have 5 liters of blood coursing through my body. So when you just sort of think about what that means, that's what becomes scary. It's difficult to extrapolate, to give precise numbers at this point in time, but I do know that in a few drops of blood, I had already about 11 microplastic particles.
I mean, that does sound like something which can't be good, but do we have any understanding, by which I guess I'm asking, do doctors have any understanding of potentially how not good this is? Because this is also presumably something that on the quiet, or at least unconsidered, human beings have now been living with for a few decades at least.
Yeah, but increasingly so, right? Because the microplastic burden is growing year by year as we create more plastics. So, yeah, it's something that's quite nascent as a science. It's only begun in the last few years that scientists are starting to look into the human body, and they're finding these plastics everywhere they look. I don't know if you saw just in the headlines today, they've found microplastics in penile tissue. Last week, they found it in every male testes that they had tested. They have found it in semen. This is all just basically very, very recent science. So the next part of the question is really going to be causation, right? So the causative studies, scientists are looking into them now. They're probably going to have more results and more data in the coming years, probably within 1 or 2 years, scientists estimate. But there was a big study that just came out quite recently, I believe in March. It was in a very prestigious journal, the New England Journal of Medicine. It had a large sample study. They looked at about 300 people, and they were looking at the plaques in the carotid arteries. And what they were finding was that people who had microplastics in those plaques had a much greater chance of stroke, heart attack, or death, about 4.5 times greater. And what they're surmising is that it's possible, what it looks like is those microplastics, when they get caught in those, when you have quite a few of those microplastics in the plaques, they make those plaques more brittle. And when they're more brittle, they're more likely to shed or kind of flake off and then enter the bloodstream. And of course, things like that can cause a stroke. So we're starting to see those potential problems, but we also know things like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, or what have you. A lot of those folks who have been studied, again, only a few small studies right now, have higher microplastic burdens in their intestines. And we know that it causes inflammation. So there's a lot of we know that there are toxic chemicals. There's about 16,000 chemicals in plastic, about 4,200 of them we know are hazardous. So we know that they're hazardous. We know that people who work in plastics factories get cancer. That's not very contentious. But the question now is, when you have microplastics in your body, what does that cause? What kind of disease does that cause? And we're at the early stages, but I can tell you, it sure doesn't look good. I have not come across studies that are like, hey, this is looking great.
It'll be fine.
It'll be fine.
Does making a film of this sort, though, and immersing yourself so intimately in the subject, does it not freak you out personally even a little bit? Do you not come out of the end of making the film wanting to retreat to some sort of Howard Hughes-style hermetic bubble, though obviously one ideally not made of plastic, though I don't know what else you'd make a hermetic bubble out of, and just sort of not touch anything ever again?
Well, no, it doesn't. Because, I also think, and it's important to point out that there are some plastics that are simply useful. There are sutures that are used in surgery.
Well, the film starts with you putting plastic in your eyes.
Exactly. I wear contact lenses, right? So there are some plastics, although I will say it's also troubling because then you're like, okay, I wear contact lenses, and then you read up on the study about the shedding of microplastics in your eyes, and then you're like, oh. So, no, I can't live in a hermetically sealed bubble. I recognize that. I also recognize, though, that I also still live in a relatively safe place. I don't want people to feel necessarily safe because we are all consuming a lot of these microplastics. And as I shared with you earlier, the burden is already very high in an average person's bloodstream from a northern country. But from the southern countries, as you know, I visited places like Manila, Turkey. These are places where people export waste. I think about the waste pickers, millions and millions of people who are subject to highly toxic waste, the people who are working in plastic recycling factories. That plastic burden is going to be incredibly, incredibly high. So am I worried? Yes. Have I changed my behavior in some ways? Yes. One of the first things that I did was I threw out my plastic chopping board because I started realizing I am literally just using my sharp knife and grinding microplastics like salt and pepper into every meal that I have. So that went out the door pretty quickly. But then the second thing was my frying pan. The frying pan that you see in the film, it's a little bit scratched up, and I don't like throwing things away. I'm one of those people who keeps things. You're looking at a very old sweater that I'm wearing, all this sort of stuff. But when I looked at the frying pan and I realized how many billions of nanoplastics are probably leaching out, and that comes with those forever chemicals and everything, I threw that out quickly. So there's a few things that I've thrown out, and then there's a few things that I just don't use anymore. So there's things. I mean, one of the things that we say to people generally is, I just got back here. I was in Skopje, Macedonia. My mom's family is from there. And when I was growing up, my grandmother just simply didn't have that much plastic in her kitchen. There were ceramics, there were metals or what have you. And we don't have to do the impossible. We just have to return to the 1970s and 80s. We've done that. So we're not actually asking people to get rid of everything. But single-use plastics, those absolutely, it's a ridiculous use of as you and I were just saying, right? Here's a substance that has been created to be durable, to last for hundreds, thousands of years, and you're using it one time.
Well, this is a contradiction the film does get to grips with. This, and I think one of your guests does point out about plastic that literally every molecule of it manufactured still exists somewhere. And plastic, as the archival advertising also used in the film displays, has enjoyed this extraordinary trajectory from being seen as this futuristic solution to absolutely everything, this incredibly cheap, durable, barely destructible substance from which you could make all kinds of extraordinary things. And we have made all kinds of extraordinary things from plastics. There's the surgeon as well talking about, new knees and new hips for people who otherwise wouldn't have them. But when you're trying to communicate the dangers around this, how do you get people to look past convenience? Because convenience and cost always have a way of trumping most other considerations.
Well, I think the thing that we do point out in the film is that this has been a bit of a snow job, a bit of a con, right? We were very deliberately trained to throw things away. This notion of convenience, we didn't have it in the same way before. We valued quality, which was a good thing, things that lasted for a long time. That's why we have antiques from our ancestors and from our grandparents. I still don't know to this day what we're going to be handing off to our children, whether it's going to be IKEA furniture or, plastic cups or what have you. But, coffee cups is one example that we talk about in the film. People used to reuse their coffee cups, and we had to train them in the 1950s to be like, no, you throw that in the bin, because there was a marketing strategy to get people to throw things away. So that is, behavioral stuff that we can undo in the same way that we did it. It's marketing.
I mean, again, some of those old advertisements are extraordinary, and ancient advertising of any kind is always such an evocative and, I suspect, probably depressingly accurate into the mentality of a given society at a given time. But just to emphasize your point, there are advertisements which literally used to display people just heaving an entire dinner set basically out the window once they'd used it once and gone, this is marvelous. Look at all the time you saved by not washing anything up.
Exactly. And, you kindly interviewed me here when I wrote my book, The Reality Bubble. And I actually wrote about that very scene in that book. And it came from Time Life magazine. And yeah, you're right. The jubilation in the family, especially the woman who was like, I don't have to wash up for 40 hours because I'm throwing these dishes away. And you can understand why that was a seemingly good idea at the time, before people understood how toxic and how unrecyclable these products really were. And the fact that marketing strategy, again, was very deliberately to, the future of plastics is in the trash can. So that was an idea that once they realized there were only so many plastic products that they could create that were durable, that the amplification, and in order to create more and more and more products, that they would start to develop these single-use products.
I mean, it's hard not to look at that footage versus what we know now and think of without thinking of the similar trajectory described by tobacco, whereas I think it's fairly well established that even at the time when tobacco companies, and this did used to happen, were recruiting literal doctors to advertise the benefits of smoking their product, you kind of know the manufacturers always knew. Do you get that sense with plastics as well, that the people who make this stuff have not necessarily been on the same recent journey of discovery as the rest of us? They kind of always knew that none of this was doing us any good.
Yes, that's very well said and very diplomatically said. Yes, and recycling is one of those things. It's been known for a long time, and there have been recent investigative exposés that have shown that the plastics industry was really well aware of the fact that there weren't the facilities and there was not the capability to recycle, and that they had really developed these recycling campaigns with the idea that, that would greenwash a little bit of their responsibility away, put the responsibility on the consumer. You should be recycling all of this stuff. But the truth is today, as many people are well aware, only 9% of these plastics end up getting recycled in the first place. And so that was another snow job developed by the oil and gas and by the plastics industry. And there is a little bit of danger there too, because it isn't just marketing. It isn't just a swindle job. The scientists that I have been speaking with and working with, some of them are threatened. Some of them are followed. Some of them are deliberately discredited. So there's a darker campaign. I think what we're going to do is actually work on a podcast as well, develop a podcast to follow this film and get into some of those other stories, those deeper, more investigative stories as well that we weren't able to, fill into 82 minutes. But yeah, it's the same sort of thing. There's this seeding of uncertainty where there is perhaps certainty.
And did you run across any inklings of potential solutions to what is clearly a massive and incredibly pervasive problem? The reason I ask about this is I remember years ago, nearly 20 years ago now, interviewing former Vice President Al Gore about his film An Inconvenient Truth, which obviously was kind of a pioneering example of cinematic environmentalism. And the phrase that he used, which has stuck in my head ever since, he said, with this stuff, the trouble is that people go incredibly quickly from denial to despair. So when you come to them, they don't really believe there's a problem. You explain to them how big the problem is, and by the time you finish, they've just gone, oh, well, what's the point? He said it's very hard to get people in between those two states. So are there people actually figuring out a way through this, or are we all just going to have to hope that we evolve to be able to ingest plastic better than we presently do?
Well, I think that's the Kubler-Ross curve, isn't it, that you're referring to? And I think one of the stages of loss after denial and before despair is actually anger. I think people who have seen our film are actually at the anger stage. The reason we very strategically developed this film at this time is because there is a plastics treaty going on right now, right? And the next INC5 is going to be in Busan, Korea. And we actually shared this film with the INC4 delegates in Ottawa, about 400 of them. And there's groups of people within this plastics treaty. They're called the High Ambition Coalition. They're led by Rwanda and Peru. And these are folks, I have to say, I've never seen, I may not see another screening like this. There was cheering in this screening because there's a real sense that when people can make the connection, as I said at the very beginning of this interview, between planetary health and human health, that people tend to care. The difference is, a lot of people go, oh, it's the environment. What can I do? But I'll tell you, when people see microplastics or recognize that microplastics might be in their own penile tissue or start to wonder about why we do have, decreasing fertility rates or what have you, people care a lot more about their health. So we are hoping that this health shakeup will help wake people up in a sense too.
Well, I mean, self-interest, as a former Prime Minister of my own homeland once remarked, is always a trier. That's why you should always bet on it in any contest. But I've also often vaguely wondered, in terms of solutions to environmental problems, whether it is climate change, whether it is microplastics or something like that, is it ultimately going to happen when somebody figures out how they can get rich by fixing it?
That's always one thing, but it's never, I don't rely on technological determinism or capitalism to save us usually, because I have not seen that work traditionally. But I do think that, even in the film, we've seen that bans do work. So Rwanda, again, a leading nation here. If Rwanda can do it, why can't the UK do it? Why can't Canada do it? I mean, they had their first bans, especially for things like single-use bags that we ended up doing much later in about 2006, 2008, right? But then the question is, how are we going about these things? Are we creating more loopholes? The problem that I see today with these, multi-use carrier bags that I'm sure many people recognize the same thing is they're also made of plastic, except they're made of thicker plastic. So it's even worse. And then you go to the supermarket, you're banning the most token item. You go to a supermarket, everything in that supermarket, from ketchup bottles to shampoo bottles to the cucumbers wrapped in plastic, everything inside the supermarket is plastic. And then you're worried about just the carrier bag. So I think that our solutions just need to be a lot more robust.
Well, as a science broadcaster generally, when you're making a film like this or any other films which are at some level a call to action, how worried do you get that most of the people watching this probably already agree with you? Is it one of those things where the people who most need to see the film are probably the last people who are going to sit through it?
Well, I think, what I'm grateful for in this instance, and the reason why I've said I actually feel I feel a fair bit more optimistic about the plastics crisis than I do about the climate crisis even, is that it's less polarizing. People hate garbage. People hate garbage. I remember giant litter campaigns that took place when I was young, but I think people are going to hate garbage more when they see it in their own body. And that is exactly what I saw. I'm looking at bits of other people's plastic garbage in my veins. So I hope that starts to make a difference for people.
I did want to go back a bit and ask you about your journey into science broadcasting, and I will get to the question of whether it was always the aim, or, as I think is often the case with journalistic careers, it all just sort of turned out like that. But is it true that you were, in fact, at one point an encyclopedia salesperson?
It sure was. It's very true. I did sell encyclopedias, one of the best and worst experiences of my life. And it just taught me a lot about perseverance. It's a tremendous lesson in total and utter rejection, because all you would do is I would get dropped off in a town. I'm 17 years old. And you'd go door to door, 500 doors a day, 499 of them just slam in your face. It's raining. You're carrying really heavy books. This is in the 1990s when sometimes that one door would open and be like, have you heard of CD-ROMs? And I'd be really sad, really, really sad. But then I became the number 2 salesperson in Canada because I guess I'm ferociously tenacious. And so it gave me
Do you still nurse an enduring grudge against number 1?
No, bless them. They had more endurance than I did. They can go. But that is how I got into television broadcasting, because I had no background and no agent, no experience, but I had the ability to knock on doors. So I knocked on 2,000. I emailed 2,000 TV executives, and all of them said no, except for one. And they gave me a little audition. And then somebody else, when SARS broke out, that happened in British Columbia. So I went to UBC and asked if I could do a report there. And that was my first piece of science journalism. And I put those 2 little pieces together, and then I ended up getting my first national show. But that wouldn't have happened unless I was insanely persistent.
I mean, there's the lesson in persistence, which I can see is important to being an encyclopedia salesperson as well as being a journalist. But I did wonder, and stop me if this is a reach, if you see a commonality as well between, attempting to share knowledge with people who may or may not be receptive to it.
This is the big question, the big trick, the big challenge of our time. I definitely see that as a challenge. I've been doing this, as you know, for 2 decades now, and trying to get people to care about the most important issues of our day that nobody cares about is tricky. But I will say, in the context of plastic people, I wanted to and I think you know this also, again, from the reality bubble, my passion has been trying to show people invisible threats, right? That's exactly what the reality bubble is about. And if you think about the oil and gas industry, they are responsible for 2 absolutely enormous and monstrous invisible threats. Two sides of the same coin. On one side, you have the climate crisis. It's invisible. You can't see CO2 coming out of tailpipes, just as you can't see it coming out of buildings. And on the other side, you have the microplastics crisis. You can't see that either because they're invisible. So one thing that I learned in doing science journalism is I had a chance to actually go diving under the BP oil spill. You probably remember when that happened. And I very quickly recognized that when people see an oil spill, holy shit, they act, and they act fast. Oil spills get cleaned up pretty quickly. So for me, it became very important to show people what an oil spill looks like in the human body. And it becomes very important to be able to visualize for people what the actual threat is. It's very difficult to care about invisible threats. So how do we make them visible? And I think that is the job of a science journalist.
Is the key, and this is something I wonder about journalism more generally, is it not so much about telling people stuff, but making them want to ask things? You're trying to make people curious, right?
Yes, absolutely. You're trying to make people curious, but also it's a lot about storytelling. We know for a fact that facts don't matter. We know for a fact that statistics don't work, that eyes glaze over. So how can we tell you a compelling story about the world that you live in that is actually going to have really serious, harmful impacts? And that are going to impact you and your body and your family. And I feel that the discussion so far with environmentalism has been abstract, but also distant. It's always happening somewhere else, at punctuated times. But when it very consistently starts to happen to us and to our families, I have no doubt people will care. The thing now is that klaxon call to start getting it out now so that people care now before it's too late.
But on the storytelling front, though, and in terms of the work you do in science/environmental broadcasting, what have you learnt about what lands versus what does cause the eyes to glaze over? Because to bring listeners in on a conversation we were having in the waiting room beforehand, this is something I struggle with personally, and I know we've had difficulty putting together radio programs on when you're trying to talk about things like the climate and the environment, which is obviously all about as important as a story gets. But it's kind of hard to make seem exciting and involving. You do get the eyes glazing over quite quickly with this in a way that you don't with other crises like wars or famines or political upheavals.
Yeah, but the crazy thing is the climate crisis is going to lead to wars and political crises and famines. So I think we need to be talking about the wars, the political crises, and the famines. And we need to be able to connect those dots for people, right? We can't be talking about the invisible CO2 all the time because that's very hard for people to register. But when we start talking about the things like, the fact that the soil temperature in Spain is 60 degrees and you simply can't grow food, like how are you going to get your food? And when the water starts to disappear off the peaks of the mountains and underneath the aquifers, how are we going to drink water and how is that water going to be used to irrigate our food systems? Then those questions become a lot more immediate. So we need to be focusing on the immediate concerns, the immediate threats, and not so much the distal ones, because those are a lot harder to care about. When people are talking about parts per million, I get it. And the scientists need to be paying attention to that. No doubt about it. But it's a little too wonky. It's a little too nerdy for the average person to understand or to be able to piece together, how does this affect my supermarket prices? Why is the food price going up? Let's tie those pieces together. And I seem to be now, my beat seems to be horror science. So that's, what I mean? Like I've been, as I said, this movie is a horror movie. My next movie is going to be a horror movie. They're all going to be horror movies.
When you look, though, at the communications on this subject that comes from such governments as the world has that are trying to take this seriously, do you think they're doing a good enough job of communicating what needs to be done and why it needs to be done, even if it may end up costing us quite a lot of effort and money?
I do not think that they're doing as good of a job as they need to be. I mean, we know that even from things like the IPCC reports, right? You've had this going on for years and years and years, so many iterations, and only in the last one did they include the words oil and gas. How does that actually happen? How do you actually omit the actual primary cause of the problem from years and years of incredibly thick texts. There's encyclopedias worth of text, and they're missing the key words until finally just this last iteration. So that gives me a sense that, it's far from sufficient, and governments have been whiffle-waffling for far too long.
And is that because there is that thing? I know you mentioned Rwanda earlier, and obviously one advantage that Rwanda's President Paul Kagame has is that he's not really ever obliged to seek office again in proper elections. Is there a problem, and I don't know if you've figured out how to crack this one, that almost by definition, the governments of democratic nations rarely think further ahead than 3 or 4 years because they probably won't be here?
That's you're hitting upon a really tricky but true point, right? It's very hard to solve a problem in 4 years and then have it undone in 4 years and then have a new government place some new structures in there 4 years later and then to have them undone. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. That is tricky. And Rwanda, without getting into the politics there, because I have my issues with the politics there, their environmental policies, I will say, whoever's in charge of the environmental policies has done a good job and has had the mandate to do a good job. And I've seen that. Their foreign policy, I have a lot of issues with, but that's not the topic of this particular monocle.
Indeed not. Just finally then, you did allude to another sort of chapter of your own personal book of revelations that you are actually working on. Can you tell us a bit about what the next film's going to be?
I actually am attached to 2 films. I'll mention the first one because it's a little further along right now, but it's not going to be a lullaby. So, yes, with the same team that we developed Plastic People, we're currently working on a documentary feature length that is going to be about wildfires. And it is going to be about the horrific impact of wildfires, but the impact that it's going to have on us. Again, this tie between the planetary and the human, making those connections, making them direct, having a better understanding of how wildfires around the globe are going to affect civilization and our ability to inhabit this earth itself.
Not a barrel of laughs, doubtless, but as a closing thought, how do you, I guess, maintain any amount of optimism when you go into these projects and when you come out of them? Because if you weren't at some level optimistic that this was making some difference, you'd stop making them, right? So where does that impetus come from?
Well, I think it really comes from being surrounded by thinkers and activists and heroes that I've seen create remarkable change. My friend, the late activist Rob Stewart, developed the film Sharkwater. I saw all the incredible changes he was able to make to places like Palau to stop shark finning, all those sorts of things. I've seen what Jane Goodall has done. I've seen what David Suzuki has done. So on an individual level, I've seen incredible changes. I've seen changes to the ozone. I've seen changes to all sorts of different horrible toxins that we used to have in the environment that we no longer have. So there is always hope. There is always change. You need people with the persistence of an encyclopedia salesperson to get through it, and a bit of a chuckle and a little bit of a laugh if you're going to be dealing with horror all day long. But I still maintain that hope. And I know that, this world that we live on is an absolute miracle. So when you love the world, you got to fight to protect it.
Ziya Tong, thank you very much for joining us on The Big Interview on Monocle Radio. That's it for this edition of The Big Interview. It was produced by Gunnar Gronlid and edited by Jack Dewars. From me, Andrew Mueller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.